There is nothing more disappointing than a bad ending to a good movie. Just imagine it. You're there in the theater. The movie is about to come to its dramatic climax. The bad guys and the good guys are about to have it out. Guns are drawn. The showdown is about to begin. And then suddenly, flashing on the screen, it says, the end. And the credits start rolling. And the movie is over. And you scratch your head. And the crowd starts booing. And you storm out of the theater in disgust. You want a refund. It's not supposed to end like this. You demand to know the rest of the story. That is precisely the way the Gospel of Mark comes to an ending. Oh, it's a great story, isn't it? The life and adventures of Jesus of Nazareth. He performs great miracles, defends the little guys, confronts the corrupt authorities. The bad guys kill him on a cross, but just when we thought the story was over, the tomb is empty. And at the last minute, Jesus gets away. But where is he? There is no Jesus in the Gospel of Mark. What is this? Some kind of April Fool's joke? You know, what is tomorrow? April Fool's Day. You know, occasionally April Fool's Day falls on Easter. Last time that happened was in 2018. April Fool's this year too also falls very close to Easter. It's tomorrow. I think that is wonderfully ironic because there is a connection between the two, between Easter and April Fool's Day. For when that young man told the women at the empty tomb that Jesus must have been raised from the dead, they must have felt as if someone was playing a prank on them. And a cruel prank at that. No, they didn't celebrate April Fool's Day back then. But they might as well have, with news like this. And Mark leaves us hanging. This is no way to end a good story. There's got to be more. We go to the other New Testament Gospels, Matthew, Luke, and John. There, sure enough, Jesus appears to his disciples and shows that he is risen from the dead. But in Mark, we are simply left hanging. In fact, literally, in the middle of a sentence. Some well-meaning Christians believed centuries ago that the Gospel of Mark should not end this way. So they tried to fix it by giving it a second, longer, better ending where Jesus does appear and his followers are miraculously able to handle poisonous snakes and swig arsenic cocktails. Wow, what an ending. But most scholars, rightly so, believe that this second ending was not part of the original. It is not what Mark intended. Oh, I know that Mark was probably tempted to provide a more conventional ending, one more like the other Gospels, where there are no loose ends, and the audience is comforted, and the hero rides off into the sunset, and all is well on the frontier, and life has a happy ending. But Mark does not tie up all the loose ends in some sort of conventional happy ending. Why? Because Mark did not live in a world filled with happy endings. Mark wrote to Christians who were suffering under the vicious first century persecutions of the Romans. Mark could not talk of a world where all is well, where everything works out for the best, and the hero rides off into the sunset. Life was not like that for most early Christians. Many suffered for their faith, lived troubled lives, and found faith difficult. Many struggled with death and despair itself. Many even died for the faith. Such a happy ending would never be believable. For the people he wrote this gospel did not live in a world where everything was just fine. And you know, folks, neither do we. So Mark deliberately leaves us hanging. There is no appearance of the risen Jesus. There are no glorious angels, no heavenly chorus singing alleluias, only a young man dressed in a white robe. The women do not rejoice. They do not immediately believe that Jesus had risen from the dead. They do not run off and tell the world the good news. On the contrary, they are stunned, shocked, and flee from the empty tomb, amazed, dumbfounded, and afraid. And they do not say anything to anyone. Perhaps those who read or hear this story are supposed to fill in the blank. Oh, maybe that's our job. Maybe that's what Mark had in mind. Perhaps we are, as the 21st century readers of the story, we are supposed to do what the terrified women failed to do, to bear witness in our words and deeds to the risen Lord. In other words, Mark deliberately leaves his story unfinished and incomplete because we are supposed to write the rest of the story. But isn't that exactly what is wrong with our lives and this world? We don't live our lives trusting the power of Jesus' resurrection. In our hands, the story always seems to end miserably and even more confused and mangled than it does in the Gospel of Mark. Oh yes, the tomb is empty. Jesus has disarmed the powers of death. And yet, we live our lives as if it never happened. The end we write to the story with our lives is still lived in fear. The tomb may be empty, but we are still afraid of losing control, our power, our status. Our lives remain the story of a struggle to make a name for ourselves and achieve some fame and some recognition that will enable us to endure the final onslaught of the grave. Even though we all will return to the earth, dust to dust, ashes to ashes, we will do anything to be remembered. And the sin-littered pages of history are testimonies to humanity's failed attempts at immortality. Perhaps that is why the women flee in fear. They had grown comfortable with a world limited by death. They had come to the tomb to wrap it up, to finish burying the body of Jesus, and to complete their grieving. They had come to do what we all do, accept the inevitable, grin and bear it, for it's back to business as usual, back to a world where you've always got to cover your bases. Then this April Fool's joke gets played on them. What if Jesus had actually risen and was truly alive? Then the world had changed. The limits with which they had grown comfortable are gone. Now with the empty tomb before them, they are afraid. If Jesus is alive, oh my gosh, what will he do? He will make us pay for our bad faith, they must have thought. We have failed to believe that this could ever happen. They did not know what to do. So they run, afraid of what this might mean, afraid for their lives, and afraid of God. Mark doesn't tell us where they went. But I think I know. The young man dressed in white, probably an angel, told them, Jesus has been raised. He is not here. Look, here is the place where they have laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. And those women went to Galilee, afraid they would never be able to write the rest of the story. But there, in Galilee, they discovered that the young man was telling them the truth. There, Jesus met them alive by rising ahead of them, by rising from the dead. Jesus had already written the story for them and for us. Jesus had kept his promise, just as he said. So why do I believe this happened? Because the Gospel of Mark would never have been written if they had not seen him in Galilee. Throughout the Gospel of Mark, Jesus always kept his promises. It would have been unprecedented for Jesus not to keep a promise and finish the story. Jesus promised his disciples that they would find a colt for him to ride into Jerusalem in his Palm Sunday parade. They found one. And Jesus had cursed the fig tree. And sure enough, in a few days, the fig tree had died. And Jesus had promised his disciples that they would find a man with a water jar who would lead them to the upper room for the Last Supper. And it happened, just as he said. Jesus had promised the disciples that they would desert him, and that one of them would betray him, and that Peter would deny him 3 times before the cock crowed, that he would be arrested and crucified. And it all happened just as he had told them. And he had also promised that he would be raised from the dead. And the final proof was this empty tomb and the word, the promise of this young man dressed in a white robe. His promise, he has risen, he is not here, he is going ahead of you into Galilee, and you will see him there just as he told you. So why Galilee? Galilee, what is about as close to nowhere as you could ever get. I mean, why didn't those women and Jesus' disciples just call a news conference in Jerusalem or in Rome and beg all the media to come for some spectacular announcement? But they didn't. They went to Galilee. But that is exactly the point. The rest of Mark's story, the story of Jesus and his resurrection, will get played out not before the blazing lights and ever-present TV cameras, but will be in the obscure and ordinary places of life in Galilee. Galilee. Galilee is in the dirty dishes and the dirty diapers and the piles of dirty laundry. Galilee is where the hours of work go unrewarded and unappreciated. Galilee is where you are downsized when you see your children suffer for their bad choices, when you receive a voicemail from your doctor that you are to call him back as soon as you can. Galilee is that empty chair at the kitchen table where your spouse sat for so many years, carrying on with you wonderful conversations late into the night. But that chair now never to be filled again. Galilee. The promise uttered by that young man dressed in white in the empty tomb assures us that it is precisely in such Galilees where we will meet the risen Jesus at the table, at the font, as a nervous and self-conscious volunteer teaches her Sunday school class. As a prayer is spoken at the bedside of the dying, as workers seek to do their best, as forgiveness is exchanged by husbands and wives in the quiet darkness of the night, where the tears of the grieving are wiped away. There is Jesus, alive, speaking his promise, assuring us that we will always be loved, that we will always have lives that matter, that we have nothing to fear, not even death itself. And folks, this is no April Fool's joke. This is the rest of the story. And for that, on this blessed Easter, what can we say? What can we shout? But Christ is risen. Hallelujah. Let's sing.